us today for our speaker series talk with Dr. Ajay Parsaram. If you feel comfortable, please go ahead and share your name and your department. It lets us know who each other are. Welcome everyone and good afternoon. My name is Tina Changer and I am the Manager of Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging at Sinai Health. And it's very encouraging and humbling to see everyone join us for today's talk with Dr. Ajay Parsaram. Dr. Parsaram is going to talk about why Islamophobia is normalized. And it's important for us to learn together and have these conversations together as we move forward in our journey on addressing issues such as racism, oppression, diversity, and inclusion. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before we turn things over to Ajay, let's begin with our territorial land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered today on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe Chippewa, and Huron-Wendat nations. Today's speaker, Dr. Ajay Parsaram, is a multi-generational, transnational byproduct of British colonialism, whose background connects South Asia, the Caribbean, and Turtle Island, also known as North America. He teaches in the Departments of International Development Studies and History and is cross-appointed in the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie University in Chibuktuk, also known as Halifax, and the unceded Mi'kmaq territories. Ajay is also a founding fellow at the MacEachin Institute of Public Policy and Governance since 2019, and has served as the chair and program chair of the Global Development section of the International Studies Association between 2019 and 2020. Ajay has a PhD in political science with specializations in international relations, comparative politics, and political economy from Carleton University, and has edited a grassroots newspaper while in Ottawa. His research, writing, teaching, and consulting includes a focus on structural forms of violence, including race, caste, class, and patriarchy. That includes subjects of Canadian foreign immigration and citizenship policy, race and racism, decolonization, as well as colonial and post-colonial state formation and development. Ajay has also worked as a federal public servant and as a researcher based at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thank you so much for being here today with us, and over to you, Ajay.
Thank you so much, Tina. Salam alaikum, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to, well, first say that I'm coming to you right now, although I'm based in Mi'kmaq most of the time, far on the East Coast. I'm currently coming to you from Coast Salish territories out west, kind of right around the border point of Musqueam and Salish territories and the kind of far suburbs of the West Coast. So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm gonna put up some slides. I had said I wasn't going to do too many slides, but I talk way too much if I don't try and limit myself to some extent. So I hope you'll bear with me. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to, I probably won't be able to see you, but please feel free to unmute yourself and say, hey, slow down, or hey, can you tell me what that means? I don't get that. I'm totally comfortable with that. Pretty casual presentation, in, well, in as much as a topic as heavy as this can be casual, I'm casual and open to your questions. So, and if I could ask Tina or Mary or someone, could you maybe just give me a sign or something, or just interrupt me if I'm going on too long, just so I know that we can leave adequate time for questions. Okay, thank you. So here we go. Why is Islamophobia normalized? So the first thing I would want to do is talk a little bit about positionality and intersectionality, which are subjects that I know that you've discussed before in the speaker series. But I think it's essential to kind of get a bit of a refresher about how and why that is so significant if we're able to understand the context for Islamophobia as a form of racism. And I've limited myself to a very small amount of history. As a history prof, I love the history stuff, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the conceptual frameworks of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, actually, the three of them together. And I want to present not as the definitive aspect of Islamophobia today from that, but I want to show what the historical origins of the conflict kind of looks like, which doesn't in any way determine what the outcome of Islamophobia has been. That is very much determined in the modern context, and we'll talk about that. So then we'll talk a little about normalized white supremacy at two different scopes: the structural level, the society level, and then individual level, and kind of how confusion between the two creates an awful lot of noise. And then finally, I want to talk about Islamophobia as a function of structural white supremacy that goes unchecked in Canadian society, drawing on these ideas of civilizational binaries and mythologies. And then finally, I just want to share a couple of ideas about how we can go about dismantling Islamophobia through building racial resilience. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing in that regard towards the end. So just to refresh us, positionality is important because it affects the way that you experience the world. The idea of it develops within feminist and post-colonial studies in the 70s and 80s. Really comes to the forefront with Kim Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. But in a nutshell, really all we need to know to appreciate the value of positionality, or rather the essentialness of positionality, is that the way you experience the world is not the same as the way everybody else experiences the world. So there's an individual element to it, but that individual element is actually based on societal level biases and assumptions about who you are based on what you look like, or what's on your head or what's not on your head. And the way that I came to understand this for the first time, because I was also somewhat hesitant to this idea, trained as I was at the time in universal ethics and blah, 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 everything's the same. And then a feminist said to me one day, look, when you get off the bus and walk home, what's your experience like? Because it's nothing like mine. And I hadn't thought about it. Something as simple as this, we were talking just before everybody came in about how it's our everyday occurrences that are in many ways the most significant things in terms of affecting how we understand the world, and also how the world is recreated over and over and over again. So the gendered experience of I remember what catalyzed that conversation for me initially so many years ago was I was just saying to my friend, kind of teasing my friend and being like, so what's up with this? Like, how come you can just request a stop, and because I'm a man, I have to like wait and then walk back half a kilometer. And she had a really good answer. You'd be surprised sometimes. There's oftentimes a really good answer behind all of these things that seem, what's the word I'd be looking for here? Not based on equality. And I think this is one of the fundamental problems of the notion of equality, is that equality assumes an equal society. And those of us who do equity work know that equity is the labor that is required to create an equal society. So there's work to be done there, and positionality, being true to our positionality, helps us to understand that. My positionality is very relevant for a talk like this. It's been years since I've been asked to speak about Islamophobia in particular. So I did a lot of thinking and introspection about, should I even be talking about this? And I think I can, and here's why. And I just want to lay this out to you. So as Tina said, I am a transnational, multi-generational byproduct of the British Empire. What I mean by that is that my people were displaced by British political economic policies in the 19th century. And we were indentured to sugar plantations across the Caribbean, all over the world. My particular family ended up in Kairi, which is the indigenous name for Trinidad. It was named Trinidad because some lost European named Columbus saw some mountains and named it in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. irrespective of what people who had been living there for thousands of years had called it. And we arrived and were put into this kind of racial political milieu right from the get-go, because self-emancipated Africans in the Caribbean were withholding their labor in the immediate aftermath of slavery as a strategy of, building a more equitable work environment for themselves. And then in comes South Asian people as unwitting kind of scab laborers into this, and the politics of race and racial acrimony in Trinidad between people of South Asian and people of African ancestry, even though so many people are just kind of mixed and all the same, it has its origins in these political economic decisions of empire. So I was personally raised in a working class household growing up, mostly in Canada, across different parts of Canada, but I also come from an upper caste background. And I won't belabor the point about caste, but anytime we're thinking about South Asians, caste is a very important phenomena. To be honest, it's a pretty putrid system where how you're born determines the sort of limit of what you can and can't do. And it's particularly pernicious against those of lower castes who are forced to do some very terrible labor and subjected to dehumanizing kinds of work. It's not as much of a thing in places like Trinidad, although I do think that even assuming that speaks to my inherent caste privilege. So I only say that speculatively based on what I've learned. This person I'm posing with here is my uncle, who's a pundit. He's actually the Dharmacharya, so kind of like a pope for Trinidad. So I come from this kind of strong Hindu family, and the reason why that's important is because, and I'll say this a little bit more about this later, there's no place in the world that's more Islamophobic right now than India. Because of the political situation in India. And that's related to lots of other things that are only kind of tangentially relevant to today's talk, but I'm happy to take questions about that if anybody wants to know more. So I'm learning to live my life as an immigrant to Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And it's because I don't think that we can understand Canada or Turtle Island or Mi'kma'ki in isolation. They all come together, and it's the coexistence of all of these places is the inheritance of all who call this place home, regardless of where it is we are. This is the necessity of existence in a settler colony like Canada. And then I married into an Ismaili Shia family of former refugees from East Africa. So then there's also that layer of racial tension and Islamic kind of context that is part of my life. And it has become much more so because I'm the father to a young, brown, and nominally Hindu and Muslim daughter who's, you might even hear outside here. She's only 3, and thus the last 3 years, a lot of these issues have come to the fore for me in terms of the work that I do. So I want to offer a couple of definitions. First, what is structural white supremacy and what is racism? These are two things that when I refer to them, I'm referring to systems, not individuals. So it defines the institutional and cultural practices that have rendered the ideas, the values, and the assumptions of Western Europe as having universal validity. So meaning, this is relevant and true everywhere all over the world. This has been the starting assumption. It's been the guiding principles of late empire in particular, not so much early empire. And it's done without regard for how all knowledge is actually collaborative in some sense and borrows from one another. And in particular, though, the way that the advancements of modernity within Western Europe was actually linked to much, much earlier developments in the Islamic world is something that goes particularly under-acknowledged. So then when I talk about white supremacist, this is at the level of an individual. So here I'm referring to 2 different ways of thinking about it. One is that, a person who is specifically interested in the white domination of society. And that's not that common, although it is alarmingly still quite common. in society. And then what I mean here is that a white supremacist is a product of a white supremacist society, unless they're working actively against white supremacy. And here I'm kind of borrowing inspiration from Ibram X. Kendi's views about how to be an anti-racist. The idea is that if you're not actively working to dismantle something, then you're sort of tacitly complicit in the reproduction, the cultural and political reproduction of those systems that oppress. And then racism. Racism is similar to structural white supremacy. I mean, they're very, very related. But by racism, I'm referring to many forms of structural powers, including heteropatriarchy, class, ableism, etc. But what makes it different is that, you know, class is a structural condition, but it's one that you can change. Race is both fictitious and generally unchangeable. So that's what makes it kind of like, you know, different. A lot of times when people talk about the importance of race or the importance of gender, the immediate kind of like knee-jerk reaction is to say, what about class? But of course, it's not an either or situation. Class is a raced condition and it is gendered as well. But what makes class a little bit different is that it has the ability to change. And then finally, and perhaps most centrally, understanding all of this, what is Islamophobia? Well, it's a particular manifestation of racism that brings together structural white supremacy as well as religious and civilizational tension to present Muslims as a fundamental and existential threat to quote unquote our civilization, by which we mean white Western European civilization that has been globalized and has global implications. So moving ahead, what does it look like? How does it get normalized? I mean, you know, I think some of this won't come up too much as a surprise to many of you if you've ever watched a movie in the English language. I was trying to put together a montage of different images, and I thought in some ways Dr. Jones over here gives us the prime example of Western exceptionalism, the kind of dispensability of Islamic life that we take for granted and see. This is considered one of the most humorous scenes actually of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I think might have even, like, we're not 1984, that movie might have come out. So long before 9/11, Muslims and Muslim bodies and Muslim subjectivities have been represented as other. So been represented as something that is not the norm. And a lot of that work comes from the groundbreaking work of the early post-colonial theorist and literary theorist Edward Said, Palestinian Christian author, who wrote a very famous book called Orientalism. I won't get into too much of it now, but you know, basically here we can see in analyzing this just GIF really of what happens. You see the representation of the knower as the kind of heroic white male, in this case archaeologist, who's trying to find all of these religious, it's the Ark of the Covenant, I think, in this movie. And you see the conflict unfolding between East and West civilizational binaries. And it plays out in the real world and right here in Canada, because we oftentimes talk about this as an American problem. And I think it's really important to see this as a Canadian problem as well. Canada's quote unquote zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices act, for example, in 2015, which actually received royal assent prior to the election, was something that very specifically and publicly went after Muslims. And we see that in a way that doesn't come out in the letter of the law, of course, but you can see it in how the political campaign unfolded and how so much of that election actually hinged on Sunira Ishaq's position that she should be able to become a Canadian citizen while wearing the veil. And the Conservatives planted their flag on, no, you can't, we must see your face. And the Liberals planted their flag on, we don't care. And then, you know, I'm not saying that was the defining aspect of the election, but it was one part of that election. So, and then of course, we also see Quebec's alleged secularism laws, which again, when you look at the letter of the text, it doesn't even name Muslims or Islam or Sikhism or anything. But when we see how it is applied, how the law is applied, it specifically targets it has its biggest impact on Muslims and Sikhs as well. And the element of the civilizational binary and the representation of good and evil is captured beautifully in the work of Frantz Fanon, who's not writing about Islam in particular, but when we think in colonial terms, the whole principle of otherness is that while the white male kind of subjectivity is the agent and the focus, everything else gets considered other, whether you're a quote unquote native or Black or Indian. Those differences, and having spent many years working through colonial archives, they use these words often interchangeably. So I think it's relevant to think about Fanon when he writes that Native society is not simply described as a society lacking in values. It is not enough for the colonists to affirm that these values have disappeared from, or still better, never existed in the colonial world. The Native is declared insensible to ethics. He represents not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, let us dare to admit, the enemy of values. And in this sense, he is absolute evil. Which, not to belabor the point, but certainly when you think about popular culture representations of Islam in the West, the so-called West, this is what you see. So I want to, where did this come from? You know, like how could we have ended up in a situation where this could not only happen, but actually be considered so normal that it's not even worthy of of attention for the most part? And in my view, in my work, I think this has a lot to do with dueling, competing forms of universalism. And what I mean by universalism here is just that there's one correct way to see and understand the world, and everything else is wrong. And without putting too fine a point on this, I think that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they, at some deep, almost subconscious level, they share this view in universalism. And I'm not trying to say that people who are Jewish, people who are Christian, and people who are Muslim share this, but when you look at the religious texts and when you look at the position espoused in them, you know, you see a universal worldview that arises out of revealed divine truth, usually through an intermediary. The angel Gabriel seems to be quite common as an intermediary here. And it arises, all three of these worldviews and ways of understanding the cosmos, they arise in very close geographic proximity to one another and in, you know, succession. And the consequence of this, I think, is enormous. And, you know, I'm not a religious scholar. That's not my main focus, but I am a scholar of ontology and a scholar of sovereignty. So when I look at these historical conflicts, what I look for are, what are the ontological motivating positions? What are the core assumptions that people believe to be true and will act and kill and die and live for? And when I think about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is an existential requirement almost to be true to whatever the perception of truth is. And what makes it different from other worldviews, say Buddhism, Hinduism, or Mi'kmaq worldviews or Algonquin worldviews, is that it's not necessarily place-based, it's universal. So it's not that this is the case for here in this little part of the world, it's that this is the case for everywhere on earth. And that became really important, especially in the colonial period. And not even in the early colonial period, but in the late colonial period, when it became not enough to just economically exploit the world, but the imperative to civilize the world through bringing Christianity in particular to the rest of the world, and this kind of missionary and messianic kind of vision of Christianity and its connections to colonialism. And that's important not just for, you know, the sort of dialectic of Christianity and Islam, but also for how countries ended up forming around this, such that we end up with a place like India, modern India, for example, that is avowedly secular on paper. And what we see right now is that since about 2014 in particular, though a little bit earlier, we've seen the gradual sort of Hindutva, the rise of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism that has deep historical roots in the 19th century. And as a reaction to this kind of conflict of missionary colonialism. I can say more about that later, but for now, I just wanted to flag this as an origin point, or a potential origin point. And then I want to show you why, like it never was universally true in the first place. So what we call the Dark Ages and the kind of like barbaric times on the European continent, it was not so for the rest of the world. While European Christians were burning women at the stake for, helping other women give birth and knowing how herbs worked, midwifery and women and strong women um, in trade guilds and all these other things. And I highly recommend the work of Silvia Federici on this if you want to understand the development of capitalism and patriarchy together. But while this was happening, Islamic science and art was flourishing throughout the Middle East and South Asia. What you see here is a painting representation of the Mughal Emperor Akbar hosting a multi-faith conference, which he did often. He would bring together people of all kinds of different worldviews. And you can see that there's, if you can see my cursor here, there's even Jesuits that were invited because the Jesuits were already in Goa at this point. So included the Christians as well, and they would come and present their arguments and their views and philosophy in the Abadat Khana, or the Hall of Worship. All of this was motivated by Akbar's position of Sul-i-Kul, which is Persian for universal peace. This is not to suggest that the Emperor Akbar was not an imperial tyrant and warmonger and all the other things. It's just to say there was a different ethic underscoring his understanding of what it meant to govern at a time that is never associated with the Islamic world. So the question is not which civilization is civilized. The question is that it's absurd to think in civilizational terms in the first place. So yeah, moving along. How am I doing for time? Actually, I have no idea. I'm okay still?
Yeah, we'll take questions around 12:45.
12:45. Okay. Gotcha. All right. 15 minutes. So, race ultimately is a very powerful social structure. And it's a powerful social structure, even though it has no biological meaning or significance. This has been systematically debunked in both science and social science. But what we had, it's not that there was never any understanding of people being different from one another. We always understood that there were differences, but historically fluid identities were hardened by science, by Western scientists in the 18th and 19th centuries to give rise to this idea of the science of race. They sought to apply the epistemic principles of Western scientific methodologies to explain the world as they were experiencing it, I think, as kind of awkward colonists. And I say awkward colonists because, having looked closely at these historical records, it's not like every person who was involved in the colonial project was the same. When you read the papers of these colonialists in the Islamic world, in the Hindu world, wherever they were, there was a wide range of different perspectives. But like now, people were trying to rationalize and explain and justify the world that they were living in and the privileges that they enjoyed. And I think that's why I want to focus on this a little bit, was that it would have been seen as the best science of the day to simply accept that, some races are inferior to others. Just like today, it might be okay for a lot of people to say, well, it's true that if you come from this Muslim country, you might pose a security threat, which again, is, to my mind, patently absurd. But we can talk about that. Not everybody will see it that way. What it does is it misses the ontological dimensions and the limitations of studying a world system without regard for people's specific placement within it. And all of this comes together to produce a racial logic. It comes together with the capacity of the modern territorial state, because that also, people think about countries as being something that's always existed, but the organizational potential of the modern state is really a product of the 19th century. We never had the scale and institutional and industrial capacity to do things at the scale that we can in human society until the 19th century. So those two things come together, along with then a desire to create and inhabit nationalism. So to create a soul for this big state that we've created. And this has produced quests for purity that have always been pure fiction. And you can look to the brutality of Belgium in the Congo and the violences that they wrought on the people of the Congo. Obviously, the brutality of Germany against German and European Jews in the 20th century. But also, I think we need to confront that the NATO-led occupation of Afghanistan, Iraq, and the general disregard for Islamic sovereignty through the way NATO and its allies operate and routinely violate Pakistani sovereignty, all because Islamic sovereignty is just not considered important. It's considered the threat in and of itself. So the legacy of race, and thus the legacy of Islamophobia, though it has no biological meaning, it has endless sociological, political, and economic consequences today. So just a couple of quick examples about, because I feel like I need to give you a little bit of evidence for some of these things that I'm telling you here. Here's an example of from the 19th century in Sri Lanka. So the British believed that living in tropical environments in the 19th century would lead to the moral degeneracy of white Christian ethics in particular. And honestly, what this was, based on the best research that I could do on this, is that white farmers who were the second and third sons of, important people in England, but they weren't important enough to get land in England or Scotland. They would go to the colonies to try and make a name for themselves away from their families, away from, in many cases, other white people. And they used this as a justification to explain their sexual attraction to young Tamil women and girls, and who they would basically systematically abuse on their plantations. This was taken so seriously by the British colonial government that they started a program of transporting white women from England and Scotland to marry these planters in an effort to preserve their Christian virtue. So you can see here in an example like this how racism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and the oppression of even white women, all mixed together in this milieu. So when we talk about the different structures, we separate these different structures so we can understand them, but they're all happening simultaneously. Here's an example from Canada in the 20th century. This is a membership card from the Asiatic Exclusion League, which formed in 1907 as a trade union led organization to prevent the immigration of Asians into Canada, particularly Chinese and Indians, of which Muslims would have been a significant part of. And then this one I'll spend a little bit of time on because it's around the same time in Canada, because I want you to see how these civilizational binaries played a role in our understanding of who gets to be even a Canadian and who's welcome here. So this is a cartoon from 1907, the Saturday Sunset. And the text on the bottom says, "The same act which excludes Orientals should open the portals of British Columbia to white immigration." And you can see the gate is shut for so-called Orientals. And the gate is wide open for whites. Now, Canada had no citizenship policy at all until the 1940s. So it was de facto governed through immigration. And in 1906, you could be deported for immoral activities like being poor. Women would be deported if the man in their life became poor or committed a crime, as well as her children. In 1908, there was a very important piece of legislation that was passed called the Continuous Journey legislation, which, and this is such an important one because it shows the technocratic racism of Canadian law. This piece of legislation said, you can only come to Canada if the boat that you were arriving on can reach Canada in one shot. So if you have to stop somewhere to refuel, then you can't make it. And nobody says anything about race there, right? Except what that meant was you couldn't do that trip from Asia. You could only do that trip from Western Europe. So they got around the idea of having to say, actually, we only want white people, and accomplish the same policy objective. And I think we see this, like when you see, I mentioned the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, and like the hijab ban in Quebec. And this is how we can accomplish kind of racist outcomes Islamophobic outcomes through seemingly race-neutral legislation. There's lots of other examples. I'm not gonna, you can see it there, but I don't want to spend too much time going through legal history here. Another 20th century example, this is 1957 in Belgium, where there are still African children in zoos. This is like my parents were children around this same age, probably in 1957 or 1958. So this was not a common practice by the 1950s, but up to the 1920s, it was a common practice. This idea of a civilized West opposite kind of like capricious and nasty East really makes no sense. And then, of course, 21st century examples. Canada has not come free from any of this. This is Sunira Ishak, who kind of helped determine, I think, or influence the outcome of the 2015 election. But in the city I live in, Black men are stopped by the police 6 times more than anyone else. Indigenous land and water defenses across this country are oftentimes mischaracterized as protest instead of land defense and treated with extreme hostility, including the deployment of the military, as we saw in the Oka crisis. And then specific to Islamophobic threats, just in the last 15, 20 years, and this is not at all an exhaustive list, we have the case of University of Ottawa professor Hassan Diab, who was deported to France for crimes he never committed and languished, basically ruined his life through the extradition factor. Mahar Arer, who was famously deported to Syria for torture, again, under like trumped up security charges from Canada. Sami Yatin might be more familiar to some of you. I don't actually know if Sami was a Muslim as such, but to some extent, it doesn't overly matter. The name suggests that he was, but his treatment is what I wanted to draw your attention to, because it happened at roughly the same time as another teenager. So Sami, I'm getting ahead of myself, Sami was on a TTC streetcar all by himself with a knife and was probably having a mental health episode. And cops shot him, I forget how many times, and killed him, even though there was a person with a taser just moments away. And when this went through the court system, nobody was punished for it. So at the same time, so that, that was a stupid, reckless thing for Sami Yatin to have done, and he shouldn't have done it. But at the same time, in Edmonton, a white teenager, roughly the same age, named Skylar Murphy, brought an actual pipe bomb into the Edmonton International Airport and went through security with an operational pipe bomb, because in his spare time, he enjoyed building pipe bombs and detonating them in his yard. When the pipe bomb was found by the security personnel, they said, hey, you shouldn't have a pipe bomb. And they took it away and sent him on his family trip to Mexico. And it was only like 4 days later, when somebody was reviewing these notes, that they said, how could you have let that happen? And then he was detained and questioned when he came back from Mexico a week later. But the point is what is a threat and what isn't a threat, right? This is the root of Islamophobia, I think, in Canada, is the racialization of bodies. And of Sunira Ishak, we talked about as well. And of course, the consequences of not adequately dealing with our deeply ingrained Islamophobia and civilizational thinking is things like the Quebec Mosque massacre. So why is it normal? How could it be that this is all still normal? Just have a few minutes left. So, it's normal because it's a unique manifestation of racism. It intersects with religion, and it's thus treated as race, even though Islam has nothing to do with race. There's tons of white Muslims, but the religion itself is racialized because it intersects with lots of other forms of structural oppression, including patriarchy, including anti-Black racism, including anti-Asian racism. And it's connected to structural white supremacy through Eurocentric civilizational discourses that we see represented in popular culture over and over again. And importantly, it can occur now because it is so normal, because Islamophobia and the idea that Muslims are quote unquote less civilized is so normal. We can have this outcome of structural white supremacy happen in the absence of any white people at all, such as in India. Returning to India, the most Islamophobic country in the world, the asymmetric treatment of Muslims is something like I've never seen before. Driving through Muslim suburbs, well, not even suburbs, Muslim slums in Delhi somewhat recently, and seeing the asymmetric treatment. And that was in the early days of this kind of far-right Hindu government. And part of the cause of this, I think, is related to white fragility, which Robin DiAngelo describes as the tendency of white people to shut down, get angry and defensive, and derail conversations when the subject of whiteness has to be put in the crosshairs. And it's because white people are accustomed to not thinking about themselves as having race. So it enables, and this is the important piece here, is that white fragility enables structural white supremacy. Because of the inability to process the racial stress, because white people generally have less experience, it encourages all kinds of defensive actions. And then when a really violent thing happens, like Alexander Bézannet shooting up the Quebec masjid, rather than confronting the violence of Canadian society, you see politicians line up to say, well, Bézannet is un-Canadian. Canadians would never do this. So it becomes a project of national repair that we want to fix. Like, we want to draw attention away from Canada and Canadians and separate the terrorist, the white nationalist, as someone who's not part of society. But what I want to argue to you is that actually the white nationalist is a fundamental part of Canadian society. So, when we fail to do this, we inevitably conclude that we live in a society that's based on justice, rather than a society that is based on some justice, but is also based on racism. And then white fragility and white nationalism it's not like theoretical things, these are top security concerns in Canada, according to CSIS. But we don't have the tools to prevent and de-radicalize white people, because we still have difficulty saying the word white, which is one of the reasons why I've said the word white probably 30 times so far, just in an effort to try and, normalize this itself. We need to build the racial resilience of white people, and of all people, is what I'm coming down to most recently in my work. But, if it comes down to this relatively simple, straightforward example in one of my articles that I think I sent around, that Tina sent around, which just says, if you were going to move something that was fragile from Brussels to Kinshasa, you wouldn't put it in your checked luggage, right? You'd wrap it up, you'd take it with you on the plane, you'd find another way to transport it. So if it is the case that Robin DiAngelo and other white scholars are correct when they say that racial fragility is a real thing, I don't think that we win any favors or do accomplish anything by pretending like that's not a real thing. So we should be, I think, compassionate and understanding in how we can help people come to terms with this. So building racial resilience is we need to recognize that although race isn't real, it has social, political, and economic consequences, and that these consequences structure our institutions. And also, in order to oppose these things, you don't need to have, quote unquote, the answer to intervene. I can't tell you how to stop Islamophobia. I wish I could. But sometimes the intervention to call attention to the violence that's happening can be enough. We should also be looking to the people, the Islamophobes in our life, and look for root causes in their anxiety. The idea of somebody saying, well, they're letting too many immigrants in and they're taking my job. On the one hand, that's a racist thing, but on the other hand, it's actually a critique of how cold and cruel modern capitalism is as an economic system, that the level of economic insecurity is so extreme for working class white people in particular, that they would be quick to be kind of mopped up by this kind of right-wing populist nonsense. So people, I think, need to do more to help educate on that. And in order to truly serve the interests of Canada, we have to be willing to be critical of Canadian nationalism, even during the Olympics, even on Canada Day, all these other things. It's just necessary. And then, fundamentally, white people need to become comfortable talking about themselves in racial terms. And I have empathy for this, because they've been taught since the 60s not to do this. And I can say more about that in the questions, but I'm a little over time now. And the last thing I wanted to share was a couple of resources that I've been working on for the last couple of years that are available. One is a YouTube series called Safe Space for White Questions. We've done 18 episodes now, and you can find them all for free online. It's just white people asking us questions, and me and my co-host Alex Kasnabish, who I'm also writing this book with, frequently asked white questions based on the series. That book will be out in the fall. And I have a second book coming out in the spring, next spring, called How to Talk to Your Racist Uncle, a Manual for Racial Resilience. So I want to leave adequate time for some Q&A. So I'm just going to end it here, and I am at your mercy.
Thank you, Ajay. We'll give our audience a moment to prepare their questions. If you would like to leave your questions on the chat box or go ahead and ask, you can unmute yourself. Questions. Ajay, thank you for your talk. There was a lot of thought-provoking content. And just wanted to ask, is there any concept you'd like to go back to help elaborate or expand on? You mentioned the last part, when you give these types of talks, some of the common questions you may be receiving, as it's a lot of information to process.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say, and I'm seeing Leanne Jeff's questions is in many ways the crux of what the solution might look like. So to elaborate a little bit about what I mean about racial resilience is, you know, so in the work that I've done on white fragility, so my early work on white fragility from about 2019, I should say, I am principally a scholar of 19th century Sri Lanka. I'm a historian by practice, but what has happened since about 2016, 2017 is that the students in my life have like come knocking and banging on my door saying, where are the progressive alternatives to people like Jordan Peterson? And, how are you going to address the rising white nationalism? So my young students have come and laid those problems out. And so it's the reason why I started doing this work relatively later. My training is mostly 19th century, which is why I kind of gave you a lot of that historical stuff. But in talking to my students about white fragility and starting to do that early work on white fragility, I've been realizing that if fragility is a real problem, resilience is the only way to make something less fragile. What does building resilience look like? And from my own classrooms, I noticed oftentimes what ended up happening was that white people, if they asked a question at all during like a very progressive lecture or something, they were very terrified to say the wrong thing, ask the wrong thing, and then have their peers kind of like the quote and unquote social justice warriors, right? And I don't say that like I have a lot of love for the social justice warriors, but it's not a very effective communication strategy. And my concern was that we were actually driving white students out of progressive classrooms and into the less progressive classrooms that some of my colleagues teach, and those were the things that would lead them down the road ultimately to white nationalism. I do high school talks a lot too. And I remember being confronted by a young, 16, 17-year-old white male who articulated a lot of really strong and, ultimately misled, but still like he was clear this guy spent a lot of time on YouTube. And I was thinking, he's super smart. He's not able to get the kind of answers that he's looking for from his public school system. He's going on YouTube late at night and finding, basically getting organized into white nationalism. And he's a child, and I think this is where like being a parent has been really helpful to me on this for building empathy, is because I don't think it's that person's fault per se that they end up getting organized with these people, but what they need is alternative forms of education that can speak to them where they're at. So that's where this idea of building racial resilience through creating safe spaces, and we've taken a lot of slack for that too, which I can explain later if you're interested in that. But building up the space just so that white people have a practice space has been super important. I've done this with my colleague in the Faculty of Medicine. We've created a white fragility clinic, which is not geared towards kids, it's geared towards faculty members. But it's been very interesting, successful, and of course, like tense all the time. And then the Safe Space for White Questions, we we've been hearing a lot of good things about it. And it was done specifically so that we could have it online for free, and in hopes that as somebody's clicking through, Jonathan K or, whoever, like that maybe it would pop up on the algorithm. And some new work that we want to do is to maybe hire somebody who knows about algorithms so that they can help us figure out how to get it into those feeds, so that folks see that there's an alternative that's compassionate and interested in them. So that's what I mean.
Mentioned white or white people a lot. Is using this term okay? Because it's on the media.
Really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it there. Maybe I can just quickly paraphrase it. So the question from Joseph is that like correct me if I'm wrong here, Joseph, but it doesn't seem okay to talk about white, in part because on the media, people don't like to call people Black. They use terms that are geographically specific, like African American. When people say that the Black person or Black family or whatever, this has negative tone, and people who say it are deemed racist because skin color is being used as an identifier. So a really good question. I think it is not just okay, but essential to start talking about white, in part because when we don't say white, think about the terms that we do use. Like the amount of times I've heard the term Caucasian used, right? People probably wouldn't bat an eye around Caucasian, but Caucasian is deeply related to racial science of the 19th century and the mythology that there are different races, because the scientists of the 19th century were measuring people's noses and their heads, and they drew spurious conclusions about that. So actually, the word Caucasian is a racist term. The word white is not a racist term because it's not describing an objectively existing race. It's describing a relationship of power that's related to a person's lived experience. And whatever they say on the mainstream media, like a lot of Black people are proud to inhabit the term Black. So I don't think that there's any shame in Black. In fact, there's been many generations of effort to reclaim the dignity of Blackness, not because in the racist terminology, right, Blackness was seen as the ultimate contamination of whiteness in that racial science. But like so many terms like queer and others, the term has been used by. So I think what you see, what Joseph is correctly pointing to, is a deep hesitation in kind of liberal mainstream society to confront the racial realities. Not that race is real, but that the dynamics of power relations is real. So I feel comfortable using white and Black. I oftentimes, African American speaks to the African American experience. Ultimately, you have to use terms that people want to use for themselves. And but yeah, it's a really good question.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question from Gary. Do you have any thoughts specific to healthcare and Islamophobia?
Yeah, thanks for that. Really good question. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, right? And it comes up a lot in our white fragility clinics that we do. In terms of accommodations, when somebody comes into a hospital, and here I'm not just talking about like having halal meals or whatnot, but like cultural interpretation. If people don't necessarily have language skills, there you'll find like a lot of the accommodations that are necessary to prevent against Islamophobia will be fairly consistent with the other forms of structural racism, because at the root of it, it's about treating each individual human with the dignity that he or she or they require in all such situations. And hospitals can be incredibly hostile places to people who are not kind of how should I put it, from the majority across various different lines. And sometimes that's linguistic, sometimes that's religious. Sometimes it goes the other way too. Like many of my colleagues in the Faculty of Medicine are Muslim women who wear hijab. And it is actually the health practitioner who oftentimes experiences considerable racism from the patients that they're trying to treat. In fact, most of the time, what I've heard about, it's come from that direction, someone refusing to be treated by usually a Muslim woman. So in terms of accommodations from the patient side, I think, doing what you can to ensure that there's adequate kind of cultural and linguistic training food options. I think about this often. My grandmother-in-law is in hospital right now, and here in Vancouver, and it's a little thing, but she can't stomach the hospital food. Like nobody can stomach hospital food, let's be honest. But you would think in a place with so many South Asians, they could have dal and rice or khichdi or like, some kind of very healthy basic food available. Because as I go into the hospital to see her, everybody's South Asian or East Asian anyway. But all of the food is like, beige looking food. There's very like small kind of issues here, right? But it's in part because I don't think that administratively there's any consideration maybe differentiated between the lower mainland healthcare system in terms of food preparation and what's going on in maybe northern BC or something like that. I'm speculating. But I know when my own dad is in the hospital, as he is a lot too, the food thing is a big thing. Seems small, it makes a big difference in quality of life. And then ensuring that there are ways to intervene in Islamophobia when you see it happening, just like all forms of racism and gender. And that has to be done with care, like sometimes it can be, you might want to support your colleague who's experiencing an Islamophobic attack, but it's important to also respect her or his autonomy in that too, because especially if you're not coming from that subjectivity, this is an everyday occurrence, right? For Muslims to get these micro invalidations. So sometimes they may not want to have a conflict, especially with a patient. Sometimes they might just want to file it away, but then you can go and do some self-care, mutual care afterwards and say, look, I've witnessed that. That was really shitty. I'm sorry that happened. And I'm wondering, like, in the future, when that happens, would you like me to intervene? I didn't want to like step on your toes or something like that. That empathy can go a really long way. And then similarly, if you see that on the patient side too, and you can intervene, I think you can intervene more forcefully, maybe with a colleague who's saying something really ignorant, if you have the power to do that. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you for your questions. We just want to remind our audience, we will be putting a recording of this talk on our Systemic Bias and Racism Resource Hub. We had a very important conversation and talk today on Islamophobia. We also want to recognize today, this is the month of Ramadan, where our Muslim brothers and sisters are observing the holiest month of the year, according to their traditions. So we want to say Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim brothers and sisters. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this conversation. Thank you, Ajay, for bringing to attention some of these concepts. We do send out a survey at the end of our talks for your feedback. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please do so. We do take a look at the feedback and we use it for our program. So it's programming. So thank you everyone for joining us again today, and much appreciated. Thank you. Wishing everyone a good day ahead and week ahead.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.